we are today. This is Time Searchers presents The Legends of Metal Detecting, and today we have as our special guest Joe Patrick, innovator, author, and detectorist. And Joe, I'm certainly glad to be interviewing you here today, and it was something we just by chance how we had met. I had been out, I'm a regular garage sailor every weekend, and I go through my list, Joe, and there I saw on the list was a sale that had metal detecting magazines. And even though it was quite a distance from my house, I thought, I got to check this out. I'm always buying metal detecting stuff. And I went to the Joe's sale, and I bought a couple piles of magazines, and got talking, and I found out that I was with none other than the famous Joe Patrick.
Yeah, I remember that day, Roger. That was quite interesting.
Yeah, it was. And frankly, Joe, I didn't even know who you were. I mean, I know you by name, but I didn't know what you looked like. I had told Bill that, after I found out who you were, it was sort of like that movie where the guy had picked up Howard Hughes, and he didn't know who he was. And it was quite a thrill to actually meet you and talk to you. And I'm glad that you've finally consented that we could do an interview with you here today. But Joe, I wanted to ask you, how long have you been involved in the hobby?
I actually got interested in it back in the late 70s. I saw an article in Popular Electronics magazine about building a metal detector. And I've been in electronics since I was a kid. It's always fascinated me, anything electrical or electronic. And I ended up building a homemade BFO metal detector. Okay. And then that was my entry. That's what got me into it.
That would have been actually in the late 1960s, right?
About 1970, 71 maybe.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm a little surprised you actually built that by hand. Most people, people who have been involved in the hobby early on from those years, either they went out and bought a machine or they bought like a Heath kit. Mm-hmm. But you actually built that from scratch.
Right. I did buy a Heath kit later, but initially, because I was in electronics and I was a ham radio operator at 14, so I was familiar with electronics and components and making things, and it was kind of natural for me to be able to do that. But then I quickly found out that the BFOs don't work very well. And,
yeah.
And by the time I think it was about 79 or 80, I ended up buying a Heath kit, and that did work pretty well.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Did that have discrimination on it?
It did. Yeah, it was an old TR.
Oh, okay.
And it was a VLF TR discriminator.
And just for benefit of some people in our audience that aren't familiar with the different terms of these frequencies, the TR is a transmitter-receiver type, and the discrimination actually in those years was actually better in the TR mode than you would have in the regular VLF mode, correct?
It would discriminate iron targets better, and it did not require that the coil be moving, a motion, like a lot of the detectors are today. Today they have to be in motion to be able to discriminate. So in that sense, yeah, I mean it could discriminate better, but it lacked depth. It was affected by ground minerals more, so there were trade-offs to it. I mean, but at the time it was an improvement over the BFO.
Oh, certainly. I know some companies, such at least that I was aware of at the time, White's had come out with like the VLF discrimination. I know that it was on the Coinmaster 5. Mm-hmm. That would have been around 1974, 75. Mm-hmm. And that was like revolutionary.
Oh, yeah, really.
And I know that there were other companies that didn't have that feature, where they would actually talk against it and say that it wasn't effective discrimination for VLF, that you had to whip the coil so fast.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I take it then, what sort of places did you metal detect in those years?
Well, you have to, put everything into context. And remember, back then, that was before the internet, that was before all the online YouTube videos and everything. You didn't know people that metal detected. I mean, it was rare to find one other person that metal detected. So you were kind of out there on your own, or, you could read the hobby magazines and get a little bit of information there. But you just went with the obvious places. You went to the old schools, you went to, the parks, anything that looked old. And the nice thing about that time of metal detecting is the fact that very few things were off limits. I mean, I could walk onto any school at that time, You know, unlike today where, you know, you're viewed like, hey, what's this guy up to, you know? So it was kind of nice in a way, and I spent a lot of time in the local parks at that time.
And I would take it at that time, too, since there wasn't that many people metal detecting, there would have been plenty of fines in those days.
Oh, there were. I mean, it was nothing to come home with pockets full. A typical day in like the early 80s, mid 80s, you know, 10 to 20 silver coins in one day. You know, today sometimes you're happy to find one.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly right. And unfortunately, due to the huge influx of people that have gone into metal detecting, a lot of these places now are off limits.
Right, they are.
Yeah. Well, after the Heathkit, what was your next machine?
After that, I bought a Garrett ADS-2, and that was a killer. That detector found me many coins and artifacts.
That would have come out around 1982, correct?
That's right. And actually, in '82, I went to a local dealer in Greensburg called Sealand's Metal Detectors.
Oh yeah.
Bob Sealand bought
Yeah.
them. Yep. And I went there and I bought an ADS-2 hip mount. I loved that detector. That thing worked extremely well, and I got to know the detector really well, and I was very successful with it.
I know too that you I think you had mentioned that you had experience with the RB10.
Not personally. When I bought the Heathkit, prior to that, a buddy of mine came up my parents' house one day to show me the new RB10 that he had bought. And it just so happened that we were trying it out in my parents' front yard, and we ended up finding my brother's lost high school ring.
Wow.
How about that?
I mean, it had been lost for, you know, many years. He graduated, I think, in 1966, and we never knew what happened to the ring, and we found it that day with the RB10. And that was the impetus for me to get rid of the Heathkit and upgrade to something better. And I bought the ADS-2 at that time.
I see. And that I take it that would have been what you used mainly through the 1980s?
That's correct. I mean, I used other detectors, but that was my main detector for about 6 to 8 years.
And I take it even through the 1980s, there still would have been plenty of fines in the
Oh, there
parks.
were. There were.
And you actually, in 1988, then, you founded Patrick Electronics, correct?
That's right.
Okay, and what sort of activities did you do with Patrick Electronics?
Well, initially when I started the company, I had no thought of being a metal detector dealer. I was in consumer electronics at that time. I had an extensive background as a service tech, repairing audio, video equipment. I was a TV man way back in the 70s. So I opened Patrick Electronics as a typical, you know, repair center, working on, you know, VCRs and microwave ovens and anything consumer related. And then from that I branched out. I was also doing a little bit of printed circuit design work. I have a background as a PCB designer. So I did that and started getting into computer repair and monitors. And then one day it just hit me. I said, hey, I'm a detectorist. You know, I should be selling metal detectors. So at that time I was corresponding with Carl von Mueller, and he encouraged me. He said, go for it, you know. And I applied for a dealership and became a Tesoro dealer. And then later I went multi-line and did pretty well with it.
So you would have done that from what years?
Well, I was a full-time storefront dealer from about 1990 to 96.
I see. That would have been, even in those years, that would have been pretty tough, because I know even before, that was before the internet, there was a lot of these mail order companies running ads like in the different metal detecting magazines.
Mm-hmm.
And it was tough even then, I think, for a lot of the local dealers to survive. So I got to tell you, Joe, that was quite an achievement.
Well, everybody's, you know, competitive. I mean, there's a big market out there and everybody's fighting for a piece of it. And I always tried to, you know, be honest with my customers and sell them and recommend the equipment that I thought they needed. I never wanted to oversell anybody. I gave really good service, and it paid off. I had a lot of repeat customers, and you know, I did well with it.
Well, you were a multi-line dealer. I take it then you then moved on to other metal detectors after the Garrett ADS too?
For myself?
For yourself?
Oh yeah, yeah. Over the years, either because I purchased them directly or I got them through field testing, which I did a lot of for Lost Treasure magazine. I've had an opportunity to use many, many different brands and models of detectors, and that has really helped me a lot.
Well, that actually, Joe, that goes into another area I was going to ask you about is your involvement, authoring different articles and such. When did you become involved with field testing of metal detectors for Lost Treasure?
I think that happened somewhere around the, I want to say early to mid 1990s. I actually started writing, I think the first article that I actually had accepted and published was about 1985. And then the 90s were a period of time where I did a lot of writing, a lot of field testing. So yeah, most of the field testing was done through the 90s.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I wasn't aware that you actually, you had been published in the 1980s?
I think one or two articles.
Okay, because mainly my memory of your material was from the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
But did you decide you were going to write these reviews, and did you use your own machines out of your dealership? Or?
No. What happened there, when I had Patrick Electronics, I had started my own newsletter. It was called Tips, Treasure Information for Professional Success. And I wrote Tips actually for 5 years. And probably around, maybe around the second or third year that I did that, I had, some of the magazines were on my mailing list. There were different people in the industry that received the newsletter. And one of those people was Grace Michael from Lost Treasure. She was the editor at the time. And Grace really took a liking to my newsletter and what I was trying to do and what I stood for. And through her, I started getting assignments to write for them. And then that led into field testing.
Oh, I see. And I take it you still do field tests?
I do, not as many as I used to.
You started submitting the field reports, and you've been doing that for a long time. Would you use the detectors from your dealership, or would the manufacturers send you a machine?
Yeah, they are supplied by the manufacturer.
Okay. Well then, you were a dealer, multi-line dealer, up to around 1996. Up to that point, what would you say was probably the best machine on the market?
Oh, boy, now you're really putting me in the corner. It depends. I mean, there's a lot of good machines out there. They all do certain things.
Well, that was at that time, Joe. I'm asking like mid-1990s.
My preference has always been toward the MindLab Sovereign because it's an easy detector to operate. It worked well for the type of ground that I have in this area, the mineralization. And there is something to multi-frequency operation. It does work better.
Yeah, that was actually something that I think even whites at that time had to realize, because I think shortly after that they had the Spectrum XLT, but then after that they developed the DFX metal detector, which is a dual frequency machine. Mm-hmm. And my understanding was that they had to license that technology from MindLab.
I'd heard the same thing. I don't know if that's true or not, but I also heard that. But the thing with metal detectors, it really has more to do with where you take them. You have to have the right site. Mm-hmm. And under adverse conditions, I find that the multi-frequencies give you an edge. But, if you're hunting an area where the coins aren't that deep, you can take almost anything out there and find good finds, And the proof is in the pudding. You can look at any brand, any model, mm-hmm. and you can see legions of people that have made a lot of finds with them.
Yes, but when you say severe conditions, you talk about mineralization.
Partly, not totally. Okay. I mean, it could be trash content, the amount of trash, how much iron there is, nails, mm-hmm. ferrous material. Some of these old home sites and cellar holes that I hunt, you've got to deal with old, nails. You have to deal with coal cinders, which could be like hot rocks. So there's a lot of factors involved.
That's especially in western Pennsylvania because
Yeah.
there's so much of that slag that was dumped all over, and they dumped them on these sites. In fact, I've actually been on sites where the homes were built on top of those, where it made detecting almost impossible.
That's correct.
But you mentioned the multi-frequency. Do you think that's better for discrimination than, say, a conventional VLF machine?
I don't know if it's so much totally the discrimination factor. I like the way it handles the ground minerals. It just seems to handle it a lot smoother without as many false signals. Particularly if I'm in an area where I have a lot of hot rocks, coal cinders. You don't have that constant bombardment of false signals.